Chapter 1. Brother and Sister. Dorlcote Mill was on the River Floss. The mill was a mile from the town of St. Oggs. Edward Tulliver was the miller. He lived in the house next to the mill. The miller and his wife, Bessie Tulliver, had 2 children, a boy, Tom, and a girl, Maggie. Tom was 11 years old. Maggie was 9 years old. It was an afternoon in March 1828. Mrs. Tulliver and Maggie were standing outside the house. They were waiting for Mr. Tulliver and Tom. Tom had been away at school. He was coming back for the holidays. "Here is the horse and cart," Maggie shouted. "Here is Father. Tom is with him. Tom is back from school." "Hello, Mother." "Hello, Maggie," said Tom. "Oh, Tom, I'm happy to see you," Maggie said. "I'm happy to see you, Maggie," Tom replied. "I'm going to see my rabbits now." Maggie cried out. Her face was white. "I've got some money, Tom," she said. "Buy some more rabbits." "More rabbits? I don't want any more rabbits." "Oh, Tom," said Maggie, "your rabbits are all dead." Tom looked at Maggie. His blue eyes were angry. "You didn't feed my rabbits, Maggie. You forgot?" Tom shouted. "I hate you, Maggie. You are cruel." Maggie started to cry. "I'm sorry, Tom," she said. "Don't be angry. I'm never angry with you." "I never do anything wrong," said Tom. And he walked away into the garden. Maggie ran into the house. Tom did not love her. She cried and cried. Later, Tom came into the house. Mr. and Mrs. Tulliver were eating cakey and drinking tea. "Where is Maggie?" Mr. Tulliver asked. "I don't know," said Tom. "You must take care of your sister," said Mrs. Tulliver. "Maggie came into the house," Tom said. "She was crying." He took a big piece of cake. He sat down and he started to eat it. "Crying!" Mr. Tulliver shouted. "Why was she crying? Go and find her." Tom went slowly upstairs. He went into Maggie's bedroom. His sister was lying on the bed. She stood up and ran towards him. "Oh, Tom, I'm sorry about your rabbits," Maggie said. "I am a naughty girl." "I forgive you, Maggie," Tom said. "Stop crying now." And Maggie smiled. Chapter 2. Maggie cuts her hair. 10 days later, Mrs. Tulliver's married sisters came to dinner at Dorlcote Mill. Their husbands, Mr. Glegg and Mr. Dean, came with them, and Mr. and Mrs. Dean brought their daughter, Lucy. Maggie kissed her little cousin. Lucy Dean was 7 years old. She had pretty, fair hair. Maggie's hair was dark and untidy. Everybody sat down at the table. "Maggie's hair is always untidy," Mrs. Tulliver said. "What can I do?" "Cut her hair shorter," replied Mrs. Glegg. "Go and brush your hair, Maggie," said Mrs. Tulliver. "Go quickly. We are going to eat dinner now." Then Maggie had an idea. She spoke to her brother. "Come upstairs with me, Tom," she said quietly. Maggie and Tom went upstairs. They went into their mother's bedroom. Maggie picked up a pair of scissors. "What are you going to do, Maggie?" Tom asked. Maggie cut off a long piece of her hair. "Oh, Maggie, you are a naughty girl," Tom said. Maggie cut off some more hair. Then she gave the scissors to Tom. "Help me, Tom, quickly," she said. Tom cut once, twice, 3 times. Soon, pieces of Maggie's hair covered the floor. Tom looked at his sister and he laughed. "Don't laugh at me, Tom," said Maggie. "Everybody will laugh at you," Tom said. "I'm going downstairs now." Maggie looked in a mirror. She saw her short hair. She started to cry. 10 minutes later, Maggie went downstairs. She walked quietly into the dining room. She sat down. Mrs. Tulliver saw her daughter. She screamed and dropped a plate. Everybody looked at Maggie. "Who is this?" said Mr. Dean. He laughed. "Maggie is a naughty girl," said Mrs. Glegg. Maggie started to cry again. She stood up and she ran to her father. "Don't cry, Maggie," Mr. Tulliver said. "I love you. I will take care of you." After dinner, Tom, Maggie, and Lucy went into the garden. Mr. and Mrs. Tulliver talked to the Deans and the Gleggs. "Mr. Tulliver," said Mrs. Tulliver, "tell everybody your plan." "I want Tom to have a good education," Mr. Tulliver said. "He will go to a new teacher in August. He will go to Mr. Stelling. He will learn everything: history, Latin, mathematics." "Tom doesn't need Latin," Mrs. Glegg said. "He is going to be a miller." "He is not going to be a miller," Mr. Tulliver replied. "He's not as clever as Maggie, but I want Tom to have a good education." "Tom must learn useful things, not Latin," Mrs. Glegg said. "That is my advice." Mr. Tulliver did not like Mrs. Glegg. "You always give advice," he said. "But you don't give people money." "No, I don't give people my money," Mrs. Glegg replied. "But I have lent my money. I have lent money to somebody in this room." Mr. Tulliver was very angry. "Yes," he shouted. "You have lent me £500, and I pay you interest. I pay you £25 every year." "Don't shout at me," said Mrs. Glegg. Then she stood up. "Mr. Glegg, take me home," she said. "Yes, go home, Mrs. Glegg," Mr. Tulliver shouted. "I will pay you the money next week." Mrs. Glegg left the room and her husband followed her. But Mr. Tulliver did not have £500. He could not pay Mrs. Glegg. The next week, he went to a friend. He borrowed the money. He borrowed £500. Then he paid Mrs. Glegg. Chapter 3. Mr. Stelling's School. In August 1828, Tom went to live at Mr. Stelling's school. Tom was lonely and unhappy. The work was very difficult. The school was at King's Lorton. It was many miles from St. Ogg's. Tom did not go back to Dorlcote Mill until December. Tom went back to the mill for the Christmas holiday. He spoke to his father. "Why must I learn Latin?" Tom asked. "I hate Latin. My Uncle Dean is a rich businessman. He did not learn Latin." "You must learn Latin, Tom," Mr. Tulliver said. "Then you can learn about the law. Our neighbor wants to take water from the river Floss. He wants the water for his land, but I need the water for the mill." "There will be a lawsuit," Mr. Tulliver said. "Our neighbor is wrong. We will fight our neighbor in the law court. You must learn about the law, Tom. Then you can help me in the law of court." "Lawyer Wakeham will speak for our neighbor," Mr. Tulliver said. "He will speak in the law court. Wakeham is a very bad man. I hate him." "Mr. Wakeham's son, Philip, will go to Mr. Stelling's school," said Tom. He is going to study with Mr. Stelling, too. He will be at the school after Christmas. Philip Wakem is a thin, weak boy, Mr. Tulliver said. He is clever, but you are as clever as him. So, after Christmas, Tom went back to Mr. Stelling's school. When Tom arrived, a boy with a sad face was standing in the library. The boy was thin and he had a twisted back. He was 2 years older than Tom. "Hello," said the boy. "I'm Philip Wakem." "I'm Tom Tulliver," Tom replied. Chapter 4. The Philip Waken. In 1830, Tom Tulliver was 13 years old. He had been living at Mr. Stelling's school for 2 years. Every day he had to study for many hours. Tom was not clever. The work was difficult for him. Philip Wakem was very clever. The work was not difficult for him. Maggie often wrote letters to Tom. Maggie was 11 years old. She was clever. In her letters, she told Tom all the news. She told him about Dorlcote Mill and about the town of St. Ogg's. And Tom often wrote letters to Maggie. One day he wrote, "Dear Maggie, I want to see you. Come and visit me. Mr. Stelling is a king man. You can stay for a few days. Please come soon. Your loving brother, Tom." Maggie wrote to Tom. She was going to visit him soon. Tom was very happy. 2 days before Maggie's visit, Tom found an old sword in Mr. Stelling's house. The sword was heavy and sharp. Tom was very pleased. "I will show this sword to Maggie. It will frighten her," he thought. It was afternoon. Maggie was staying at Mr. Stelling's school. The boys were in the library. They were reading their books. Maggie sat by the fire. She looked at Philip Wakem. "He is a kind boy," she thought, "but he is sad." And Philip looked at Maggie. "She has beautiful, dark eyes," he thought. "She is a kind and gentle girl." At last, Tom closed his book. "Come upstairs with me, Maggie," he said. "I've got a secret. Turn round and shut your eyes. Look, Maggie, I am a soldier. 1, 2, 3. Oh, Tom, I am frightened. Be careful. Oh, Tom dead, Tom dead." Tom was not dead, but his foot was badly hurt. Tom had to stay in bed. Maggie took care of him. She stayed at the school for a week. One afternoon, Tom was asleep. Maggie and Philip were sitting in the library. "Maggie, I do not have a sister," Philip said quietly. "Will you be my sister? I love you, Maggie." "I love my brother," Maggie replied. "But I love you too, Philip. I am going away to school soon. I will not see you again." "I will never forget you, Maggie," Philip said. "I will never forget your beautiful dark eyes." "Thank you," said Maggie. And she kissed Philip. Chapter 5. Mr. Tulliver Loses Everything. In 1833, Tom Tulliver was 16. Philip Wakem had left Mr. Stelling's school. Tom was still studying at the school. It was a cold November day. Tom was alone in the school library. The door opened and Maggie came into the room. She was as tall as Tom and she was very beautiful. "Maggie," Tom said, "why are you here? Why are you not at your school?" "Oh, Tom, something terrible has happened," said Maggie. "What is it? Tell me, Maggie," Tom said. "Father has lost the lawsuit, Tom," said Maggie. "Father must pay for everything. He must pay our neighbor's lawyer, Mr. Wakeham. Lost the lawsuit. Father must pay Wakeham money," Tom shouted. Maggie started to cry. "There is more bad news, Tom," she said. "Father has no money. He cannot pay Wakeham. He will lose the mill, his land, everything. Mother cries all the time, and Father—" "Is Father ill?" Tom asked. "Father is very ill," Maggie replied. "He cannot walk. He has forgotten everything. Tom, you must come back to the mill." "I hate Wakeham and I hate his son," Tom said angrily. "Never speak to Philip Wakeham again, Maggie." Tom and Maggie went back to Dorlcote Mill. Mrs. Tulliver was waiting for them. "Oh, Tom," she said, "Wakeham's men will take our furniture, our clothes, everything." The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Glegg came to the mill. Mrs. Dean was with them. "How is Mr. Tulliver?" Mr. Glegg asked. "He has forgotten everything," Mrs. Tulliver replied. "And he has lost everything. We have no money. We have nothing." "This is terrible news," said Mrs. Dean. "There is no money to pay for education," said Mrs. Glegg. "Tom must get a job and Maggie must stay here. She must help her mother." Tom spoke to his aunts. "Please lend me some money," he said. "I will get a job. I will pay the money back to you." "Your aunts cannot lend you any money," said Mr. Glegg. "They need their money. They get interest on their money." The next day, Tom went to his Uncle Dean's office. Mr. Dean worked for Guest and Company in St. Ogg's. "Uncle, please give me a job," Tom said. "How old are you, Tom?" Mr. Dean asked. 16, nearly 17, Tom replied. "You had a good education," said Mr. Dean. "But Latin will not help you here." "I can learn other things," said Tom. "I will give you a job in the office," said Mr. Dean, "but you must work hard." "Thank you, Uncle," Tom said. He shook hands with his uncle, and he left the office. Outside the office, he saw a notice on the wall. "To be sold. Dorlcote Mill, with house land and furniture." Mr. Tulliver was very ill. He stayed in his bed for 2 months. On a cold day in January, he came into the dining room. "Where is the furniture?" Mr. Tulliver asked. "Wakeham's men took it," Maggie said. "They sold it. But here is your chair. Sit down, Father." "Then I have lost everything," Mr. Tulliver said. "Yes, Father," Tom replied. "And we must pay Wakeham £300 more. But I have a job. I will save my money. I will pay Wakeham." "We will look after you, Father," Maggie said. Mrs. Tulliver began to cry. "Lawyer Wakeham has bought the mill and the house," she said. "So we must leave the mill, Bessie," Mr. Tulliver replied sadly. "No," said Mrs. Tulliver. "You will work for Wakeham. You will be the miller. We will stay here." At first, Mr. Tulliver did not reply. Then he spoke. "Tom, get the Bible," he said. "Yes, Father," said Tom. He brought the Bible to his father. "Write this," said Mr. Tulliver. "Edward Tulliver will work for Lawyer Wakeham at Dorlcote Mill, but he will never forgive Wakeham. He will always hate him." "Then write this, Tom," said Mr. Tulliver. "Tom Tulliver will never forgive Lawyer Wakeham. He will always hate Wakeham and his family." then write your name." "Oh no, Tom," said Maggie. "Do not write that." "Be quiet, Maggie," Tom said. "I want to write it. I will write it." Chapter 6. The Red Deeps. For a few years, the Tullivers' lives were difficult. Mr. Tulliver hated Lawyer Wakem, but he had to work for the lawyer. Tom worked for Guest and Company in St. Ogg's. Tom saved all his money. Maggie stayed in the house. She helped her mother. One day in June 1837, Maggie's life changed. That afternoon, she was very tired. "I will walk to the Red Deeps," she thought. "I will be alone there." The Red Deeps was a beautiful, quiet place. There were many tall trees there. The grass was soft and the earth on the ground was red. Maggie liked the Red Deeps. Maggie walked slowly under the trees. But she was not alone. Philip Wakem was in the Red Deeps, too. Maggie had not seen Philip for 5 years. "Philip, why are you here?" Maggie asked. "I saw you leaving Dorlcote Mill," Philip replied. "I followed you. I have never forgotten you, Maggie. You are beautiful." "Am I beautiful, Philip?" Maggie said. "I am not beautiful. I am very unhappy." "I am unhappy too, Maggie," Philip said. "I am a man now, but I will never be tall and strong. My back will always be twisted." "Oh, Philip, that is not important," Maggie said. "Will we meet again?" Philip asked. "Will you be my friend?" "No, Philip," Maggie said. "We must not meet again. We must not be friends. I must go now. Goodbye." And Maggie walked away quickly. "I will come here again," Philip thought. "I want to meet Maggie. I want to be her friend." Philip walked to the Red Deeps every day. Then one afternoon, he saw Maggie again. They talked for a long time. After that, they often met in the Red Deeps. But Maggie told nobody. Their meetings were secret. One day Philip said, "I love you, Maggie. I want to marry you." "We cannot get married," Maggie replied. "The Tullivers hate the Wakems. I love you, but I cannot marry you." A year passed. One day, Tom saw Philip Wakem walking from the Red Deeps. Tom went back to the house. Maggie was reading a book. Tom looked at Maggie's shoes. There was red earth on them. "Maggie, have you been to the Red Deeps?" Tom asked. Maggie looked at her shoes. She saw the red earth. It was earth from the ground at the Red Deeps. "Yes, I have been there," she said. "I went for a walk." "Did you meet Philip Wakem there?" Tom asked. "Yes, Tom," Maggie replied. "I often meet him there. We talk about books and music. He lends me books." Tom was angry. "Father hates Lawyer Wakem, and I hate him too," Tom said. "You must not talk to his son." "Philip loves me," Maggie replied, "and I love him." "You are a bad daughter and a bad sister," Tom said. The next afternoon, Tom went with Maggie to the Red Deeps. Philip Wakem was there. He was waiting for Maggie. Philip looked at Tom. Then he looked at Maggie and he understood everything. Tom spoke first. "You and Maggie have met secretly," he said. "She is a bad sister, and you are a bad man. Your body is twisted and your mind is twisted too." Tom went towards Philip and he lifted his hand. "Don't write to Maggie," he said. Don't speak to her. I'll beat you. Tom, please stop, said Maggie. She was crying. Forgive me, Philip, she said. I understand, Maggie, said Philip. You have an unkind, stupid brother. I love you, Maggie. Tom does not love you. Tom pulled Maggie's arm. Come home, Maggie, he said angrily. Maggie touched Philip's hand, then Philip turned away. Tom and Maggie walked back to the mill. Tom, you were cruel to Philip, Maggie said. You are very hard, Tom. You are very unkind.